Faces were pale and eyes wide as the American sailors on the deck of the destroyer USS William D saw the ghost flying above them. It was the same low-wing silhouette that had once haunted every sailor's nightmare, the same predator that opened the war at Pearl Harbor 4 years ago. The Aichi D3A dive bomber had come back from the grave. It had been a long time since this Japanese predator had claimed its last victim, but as the D3A began to bank toward Porter, every single sailor rushed to the anti-aircraft guns as if their lives depended on it. Traces of fire rose at the spiraling attacker. It was obsolete, barely able to fly, yet no amount of shells could stop it. Then, in a blur, the D3A suddenly vanished beneath the water. There was a moment of quiet before the ocean erupted, a supernatural force pushing Porter's hull out of the water. This was an enemy that just wouldn't die. The year was 1939. In Europe, entire nations were already trembling as the boots of the Wehrmacht began Hitler's Dominion campaign across Germany's borders. Yet across the world, people were afraid of a different empire taking over. Across the skies of southwest China, people caught sight of dark shadows descending toward them like birds of prey. Aerial attacks were nothing new. Ever since Japan had launched its invasion, bombs dripped across the land day and night, obliterating city centers and claiming the lives of thousands. China was far less equipped than Japan to mount a proper counterattack, forced to resist through the ultimate sacrifice of iron-willed fighters. The battle had been gruesome, but somehow the Chinese had managed to remain standing. However, as the Japanese aircraft continued their approach, fighters began to fear that not even the fiercest resistance might be enough to counter the incoming menace this time. These were not the biplane bombers Chinese fighters had grown accustomed to throughout the war. Japan was entering a new era of aviation, introducing a batch of agile monoplane bombers into the fray, carrying their pilots into battle with unheard-of speed and the ability to reach distant targets once thought safe from aerial assault. The particular model chosen to wreak devastation on China that day was still experimental, deployed to prove its lethality before the Japanese Navy officially gave it the green light for mass production. And it would not disappoint. Darting at 270 miles per hour, the Predators were one of the fastest Japanese attackers the Chinese had ever encountered. Defenders tried to bring them down, but their basic anti-aircraft defenses could not even scratch their fuselages. The attackers responded to the fire with their twin 77mm Type 97 machine guns, forcing men on the ground to leap aside for cover before a shell found them. Inside the cockpits, the Japanese pilots didn't even bother scanning the skies for enemy fighters coming to meet them. They knew whatever the Chinese sent against them could not possibly match the beasts they commanded. Inside, the airmen kept threading across enemy skies with effortless grace until it was time to start the aircraft's final test, releasing their bombs. One by one, the aircraft began to open their bays and send 550-pound giants tumbling down below. Once the explosions rippled across the ground, pilots toppled the strike with another round, this time supported by the two 130-pound charges mounted beneath the wings of their aircraft. If there were any targets still standing, those follow-up hits would ensure they were forever gone. By the time the formation banked for home, the Chinese were still struggling to understand what had happened. It would take time before realizing they had just become the first victims of Japan's newest weapon, one of the most advanced dive bombers the world had seen up to that point. The era of the Aichi D3A had begun. Even before the war with China erupted, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already searching for a carrier-based model capable of replacing the aging D1A biplane dive bomber. The D1A, though respectable in speed and range for its time, was hopelessly outclassed by the new designs emerging in Europe and the United States. Aircraft like the American Lockheed Model 9 and the German Heinkel HE-70 Blitz had begun to experiment with low-mounted wings, which allowed aircraft to fly faster, climb quicker, and maneuver with startling ease. Many Japanese manufacturers attempted to create their own versions of a low-wing aircraft. However, it was the Nagoya-based firm Aichi Kokugi that succeeded in producing a design impressive enough for the Navy to order a formal prototype. The first version appeared as early as 1937. However, engineers quickly understood that coming up with a model set to revolutionize Japan's bombing fleet could not be accomplished overnight. Initial prototypes were too slow in their dives, unstable in their turns, and their brakes threatened to shear apart mid-flight every time they were tested. The project kept morphing as engineers were forced to start over time and again. The original 9-cylinder Nakajima Hikari 1 was eventually abandoned in favor of the Mitsubishi Kinsei 3, a 14-cylinder engine that, while only marginally faster, was far more reliable and gave pilot greater confidence in the cockpit. The tail and wings began to widen to provide better stability, and the fragile dive brakes were reinforced until they became strong enough to support even the most drastic of dives. Years passed before the aircraft was finally deemed ready. Yet when the approved version rolled out, the wait proved worthwhile. In the campaign against China, the new D3A, later known as VAL, aided the Empire to secure critical supply routes, hammer transport lines, and expand its bombing campaign over Chongqing, the city that had become China's makeshift capital. By the early 1940s, the D3A extended Japan's pressure to the sea. Supply vessels carrying the last Chinese lifelines of food, weapons, and hope were suddenly stalked by squadrons of dive bombers coming down at them in near vertical plunges. To sailors on deck, it felt as if China's days were numbered. The D3A had proven its worth in China, and with little aerial opposition left to fear, Japan's leaders grew bolder. Commanders began to consider that these new bombers were powerful enough to bring down enemies they had once thought too mighty to go to war with. And perhaps now they could finally afford to set their sights further than they'd ever dreamed, all the way to the U.S. shores. In 1941, America had not yet joined World War II. The government and public remained skeptical about entering another armed conflict, with the horrors of World War I still haunting the nation. Yet even when America insisted on staying out of the fight, Japan knew the United States was not a rival it could ignore. The moment Japan's campaign across the Pacific pressed too close for comfort, the Americans would surely stand up against their forces and threaten the territory they had fought tooth and nail to secure. Japan needed to ensure that the U.S. could not strike back, and the only way to achieve this was through a surprise raid that would cripple its naval defenses. It was a bold plan, but with the right attackers, it could just work. Around 8 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, American personnel looked down at radar screens with concern written all over their faces. Systems had just started to pick up swarms of incoming aircraft approaching straight toward them. From a pack of Japanese carriers stationed out at sea, dozens of D3As were taking off toward the base, bombs hot and ready to go. Alarms blared as chaos tore across the harbor. Sailors scrambled to their stations, but the attack was too swift and too violent for an organized defense to take place. Explosions erupted in rapid succession as D3A pilots, flanked by Nakajima B5Ns and Mitsubishi A6Ms, pressed their attacks without mercy. From the ground, desperate men returned fire with whatever they had at hand. It's said that some cadets even climbed onto the roofs of buildings, raising their rifles skyward and firing away in an attempt to shoot down the incoming waves of attackers before they could release another bomb on the burning base. Although reports vary on which specific vessels were sunk by D3A fire during Pearl Harbor, some credit the bombers with aiding in the demise of USS Arizona, one of the fleet's most iconic battleships. The ship was targeted almost as soon as the attackers arrived. Armor-piercing shells punched through her hull until one detonation ignited a blast so violent that even today, examining the wreck offers no clear answer on the precise location of where the fatal blow landed. In the blink of an eye, much of her internal structure was vaporized. Her forward turrets and conning tower collapsed as the ship split apart, igniting fires that burned for 2 days and brought the total casualty number to 1,177 men. By the time the Japanese strike force finally withdrew from Pearl Harbor, the damage to their forces had been minimal, the VAL squadron reportedly only being dealt 15 losses during the raid. The Americans, however, had suffered a catastrophic hit. 6 vessels sunk, a dozen more heavily damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, and thousands of lives claimed. It was one of the worst strikes the United States would suffer during World War II, and it could not have happened without the D3As at the front line. After witnessing the devastation brought upon Pearl Harbor by Japanese aircraft, all the Allied powers knew they could not afford to let their guard down for even a second. The British, with their precious Indian colonies and dangerously close to Japan, feared they would be next on the Val's hit list, and immediately mobilized to get their naval forces stationed across the region to defend against a potential strike. However, the British Eastern Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, was a shadow of the mighty naval forces guarding the homeland. Some of its carrier aircraft, like the painfully outdated Fairey Swordfish biplane, stood no chance against the more advanced Japanese bombers. Still, the Eastern Fleet had no other option but to face the enemy. By early 1942, Japan had already seized Singapore, putting it just a stone's throw away from India. Somerville had to play his cards just right. A daylight battle against Japan's superior carriers would surely mean annihilation. The only hope was to keep his forces one step ahead, with naval aircraft being deployed in constant patrols to track Japanese movements. If the enemy's position could be pinned down, Somerville could then plan a strike under the cover of night, when his slower, older fleet might just stand a chance of delivering a decisive strike. However, the Japanese knew how to play this game just as well, and as Somerville maneuvered to shadow them, Japanese patrol planes were doing the same. The British tried to hide their fleet by dispersing ships to secret ports and spreading them across the ocean. But by April, waves of D3As rose into the sky once again as Japanese reconnaissance aircraft began to make contact with the scattered British ships. Whether because the Japanese were in a hurry to attack these vessels before they escaped, or because Japan's supply of armor-piercing bombs was running low, some Vals took off, carrying only general-purpose ordnance designed for land targets. At first glance, this seemed like a stroke of fortune for the British. In reality, it was the exact opposite. As the D3As plunged upon their targets, those lighter bombs tore through exposed decks and shattered anti-aircraft batteries. Once the defenders were silenced, the ships were left defenseless against the next wave of attackers, set to deliver the final blow. This accidental discovery had just increased the already lethal powers of the D3A, and over the course of Japan's Indian Ocean raid, more than 20 vessels would be brought down following this same tactic. Among the most notable losses was the British carrier HMS Hermes, swarmed by nearly 8 Vals, and after enduring over 40 direct hits, sinking with 307 men still aboard. The British's worst nightmare was becoming a reality, and for the Americans, barely months into the war, the possibility of witnessing the collapse of the entire Pacific and Indian Ocean before they had a chance to avenge Pearl Harbor was starting to feel like a very real possibility. With the British Eastern Fleet bleeding in open waters, it felt like only a matter of time before Japanese forces descended to finish off Somerville's remnants and wrest India from British hands. Worse still, the campaign was spreading west and rolling down the coast, dangerously close to Australia. The only way to halt the enemy and its lethal packs of D3As was for the Americans to deal a decisive strike. Fortunately for U.S. forces, the Navy had a weapon the Japanese still didn't know about. American intelligence had been intercepting Japanese communications for months, and by mid-1942, most of Tokyo's encrypted plans were being carefully analyzed by American commanders in strategy rooms. The latest intercepts pointed to another blow coming soon. The exact target was still unclear, but U.S. commanders believed the hammer would fall near Papua New Guinea, somewhere in the Coral Sea off Australia's eastern shores. Sending carriers to meet that threat risked suffering the same fate the British had endured in the Indian Ocean. Yet, if Japan's D3A seized the region, the Allies would lose a critical hub for any counterattack. With little room to maneuver, the Americans made their call. The carriers, USS Yorktown and USS Lexington, would steam for the Coral Sea, their flight decks crowded with Grumman F-4F Wildcats, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo planes. The sailors on the vessels would never see the Japanese carriers themselves, but once the first squadrons roared off the decks, it didn't take long for pilots to spot rival formations on the horizon. These were the same predators that had terrorized Pearl Harbor: carrier-based A6M0s, B-5N Kates, And of course, the despised D3A Vals, dozens of them, coming in thirsty for blood. This time, however, the Americans were determined not to let any of them claim a single one of their ships. The showdown began the morning of May 8th. American pilots dodged and weaved as enemies unleashed streams of fire their way, returning the attack with bursts of their own as they clawed through the formation. Although the U.S. airmen were eager to shoot down as many attackers as possible, they knew the only real way to secure victory was to strike back at the Japanese carriers from which these fighters had come. But the skies ahead were dense with clouds, and it was nearly impossible for pilots to pinpoint the location of the enemy fleet. Still, squadrons of American SBD Dauntlesses pressed on. They pushed through the haze, weaving between the enemy formations, ducking into the cover of clouds, then dropping back down in their hunt for the carriers. For a moment, it felt like an impossible mission. Then suddenly, a pilot spotted a shadow through the mist, the unmistakable shape of feared carrier Shokaku, packing some of the same Aichi D3As that had rained fire over Pearl Harbor just months prior. It was time for payback. Before the Japanese aircraft chasing them could close in, 2 Dauntlesses peeled off, dove hard, and released their 1,000-pound bombs. They struck clean. The entire carrier quaked as explosions ripped through her decks, workshops and fuel tanks, erupting into fire. Hundreds of men were taken out in an instant, and aircraft operations were cut short. It seemed like a decisive American victory, but back at their own position, the situation was not good. A pack of D3As and B5Ns that had managed to leave their carriers before the Americans got to them had found USS Lexington. American fighters attempted to cut them off in their tracks, but before they could be brought down, the attackers were already within striking range. Sailors on board Lexington swung their anti-aircraft guns skyward, filling the air with a storm of tracers. 4 bombers were torn out of the sky before they could release their torpedoes, but the others pressed on. A series of torpedo hits slammed across Lexington's port side. The ship shuddered as seawater poured into the hull. Boilers went offline, her speed dropped to just 24 knots, and systems across the vessel began to fail. Damaged control parties raced to contain the situation, but soon after the torpedoes struck, a group of 20 D3As came down from above. Bombs rained onto the carrier's decks. One exploded directly over a defensive gun crew, taking them out instantly. Another explosion tore through compartments and ignited fuel, sending fire raging through what little remained of the ship's systems. Even after the D3As fled the scene, explosions and fires kept on raging across the hull of Lexington. By the time the battle was over, the only choice left was to scuttle her. The D3A had succeeded in claiming yet another American carrier. A month after the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese D3As were already on their way to deliver another blow against the Allies. This time, the target was Midway, a tiny cluster of islands sitting roughly halfway between Japan and the United States. Neutralizing Midway would sever a vital line of defense and fling the door wide open for a second strike on Pearl Harbor. The moment radar screens lit up with the approaching attackers, American F-4Fs and F-2As scrambled into the sky. However, the Japanese were not easy to counter, and for every Zero or Val the Americans managed to shoot down, another seemed to materialize, returning fire with fury at the defenders. Soon, the American fighters were overwhelmed. D3A slipped through the cracks of the formation and dove on the island below. Dirt flew into the air as explosions ripped across defenses and runways. Yet when the dust cleared, the airfields below remained operational. Frustrated, the D3A pilots banked toward the carriers, reporting that a second strike would be necessary. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carriers Kaga, Soryu, Akagi, and Hiryu, gave the order, and crews rushed to rearm and refuel their next wave. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses sprawled across the decks, putting the vessels in a delicate position that Nagumo hoped would last only minutes. However, before the first aircraft could take off, the alarm sounded. American aircraft were inbound. Zeros clawed into the sky. The intruders, unescorted American TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, were slow, exposed, and easy prey. One after another, they were shredded, plunging into the sea without a single hit to show for their bravery. However, their sacrifice was not in vain. Zeros were now scattered and low on ammunition, unable to defend the carriers, still packed with fueled and armed aircraft, as a new wave of American dive bombers approached. Years later, Mitsuo Fuchida, one of the pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor and who also stood on the carrier Akagi that day, recalled the moment, quote, "A lookout screamed, 'Helldivers.' I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes pummeling toward our ship. Some of our machine guns managed to fire a few frantic bursts at them, but it was too late." In minutes, deafening explosions ripped through Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi, taking out dozens of Japan's precious D3As with them. Now, only the carrier Hiryu remained. The tables had turned, but Admiral Nagumo was not a man to surrender easily. He called for a counterstrike, and 18 D3As roared off the deck, ready to avenge their fallen siblings. Over the decks of the American carrier Yorktown, sailors barely had time to swing their anti-aircraft guns skyward before the groups of Vals overhead began their descent toward the decks of the ship. In an instant, one of the carrier's gun mounts was obliterated, leaving her defenses crippled as more bombers dove toward the vessel. Explosions ripped through her hull. One blast knocked out a boiler, and another silenced her power entirely. The great ship began to list, her crew fighting desperately just to keep her afloat. However, the onslaught was so brutal that repair teams had no other option but to abandon their stations. Once again, the D3A had proven that, no matter how critical the situation was, in the hands of skilled pilots, it could break even the mightiest of enemies. Or at least, that's what Japan thought. When the Val pilots returned to their carriers, they were not greeted by cheers from their commander, but by the thunder of American bombs, courtesy of the aircraft carrier they had just taken out. Upon taking off from Yorktown's runways one last time before the ship was lost to the sea, American bombers had followed their ship's assassins to their lair, and alongside other attackers from USS Enterprise, secured one last hit that would cost Japan its last major carrier. Suddenly, the Val, the predator of Pearl Harbor, which had terrified sailors for years and became one of the most prolific anti-ship aircraft of the Axis forces, had lost all of its major launch platforms. Though the D3A could still pack a punch while operating from the ground or smaller vessels, its troubles were just getting started, as the Americans were on the verge of unleashing a new warrior into the skies, one that threatened to bring the Val's reign to a crashing end. By mid-1943, packs of D3As darted across the Pacific once more. This time, however, they were not surging toward an American target, but fleeing from a hunter nipping at their heels. At first glance, its silhouette resembled their old rival, the F-4F Wildcat. But these hunters were on another level entirely. Faster, tougher, and deadlier than anything Japan had yet faced. Not even the legendary Zero, long the master of Pacific skies, could match them. The American F-6F Hellcat had arrived, and it was ready to drive the Japanese back toward their homeland. No matter how hard the D3A pushed its speed, the Hellcat always seemed to catch up, ready to cut it down before it could deploy its payload over American fleets. It's estimated that over the course of the war, Hellcats would rack up more than 5,000 aerial victories, many of them at the expense of Japan's aging dive bombers. However, losing the skies was only part of the Val's downfall. With Japan's primary carriers sunk, the D3A was forced into land-based roles, guarding territory, striking opportunistically, and even serving as a makeshift fighter. The Val was never meant for such duties, but in Japan's desperate final years, the goodbye another day of resistance was pressed into service. In hopes of restoring the Val's edge, engineers began to prioritize the upgraded D3A-2. It carried extra fuel tanks for more extended missions and a propeller spinner to reduce drag. At the same time, Yokosuka engineers were working on an entirely new replacement, the faster D4Y Judy, which would go on to have over 2,000 units built. Yet even this was too little too late to stop the tide. By late 1944, the situation was critical. The Axis was collapsing on all fronts, and Japan's navy had failed to halt the Allied advance into the Philippines. There was little hope the D3A could stop the invasion, but facing ruin, Japan could not afford to let a single one of its aircraft skip the fight. Once more, the dive bombers would be summoned to go against American vessels. This time, however, they would employ a far more drastic tactic. It was November 1st when Japan ordered an immediate strike against American forces near Leyte Gulf. Just days earlier, the Allies had delivered a crushing blow in those same waters, claiming 26 Japanese ships in what's considered the largest naval battle the world has ever seen. The Empire could not allow a strike like this to go unanswered. Aboard the American destroyer Abner Reed, sailors scrambled to their stations as a lone Val dove straight toward them. Anti-aircraft guns erupted, tracers streaking into the sky, until one shell tore through the bomber's wing, ripping it clean from the fuselage. The Val shuddered violently, controls failing, yet its pilot refused to turn away. With grim determination, he held his machine steady in a final plunge toward the destroyer's deck. Gunners fired desperately, but the moment had slipped away. The dive bomber released its payload over Abner Reed, releasing a violent blast that tore across the ship. However, that was only the opening blow. Moments later, the crippled Val slammed into the main deck, vanishing in a second explosion that ripped through steel and scattered burning wreckage across the vessel. Fires raged faster than the crew could contain them. Less than 30 minutes later, Abner Reed was gone. This was not the mission the D3A had been built for, but in its new role as a kamikaze weapon, the Val could still earn some glory, even as the empire around it collapsed. In the months that followed, she claimed more victims, including the destroyer USS William D. during the Battle of Okinawa. Yet these victories were fleeting, and they could not delay the inevitable. On September 2, 1945, as Japanese officials signed the surrender aboard USS Missouri, the reign of the D3A came to its end. The dive bomber once trusted to win an empire, now only a relic of a war Japan could not win.